The book of Exodus tells the testament of an old man named Moses, desperate for a life change after years of his own exile in places he didn't choose. But life as he knew it was about to be flipped on its head. And we find in Exodus chapter 3, Moses tending the flock of sheep. When out in the distance, he sees a sight that intrigues him, a bush on fire, but not consumed. He draws closer to investigate and hears a voice calling out from the bush, and it simply says, "Moses, Moses." And he answers just as simply, "Here I am." Here I am. 3 simple words that held power, and in this particular scripture, called for an actionable response from Moses. In fact, a single word expresses this phrase in Hebrew, and it's called Hanini, which means not just here I am geographically, but also signifies being present, ready, willing, and available for a divine call or task. This word becomes a declaration by Moses that he's willing and open to God's will, even though he doesn't know the outcome. His answer of his Hanini is one of faith and is the beginning of his story of Hanini before the Lord. Throughout his life, as he became the mouthpiece of God to a Pharaoh and the leader of a stiff-necked people, Moses stood tall in his response of Hanini, ready and available whatever God asked something of him. This task included the nation of Israel and the people through the long process toward the promised land and freedom. In that burning bush moment, he renounced self so that he could do what God asked of him. He definitely struggled, but God had compassion on him and relented and gave him a promise for his obedience, which was favor in front of other nations. We see this played out in Exodus 3:21, which says, "And I will give this people, my chosen Jewish people, favor in sight of the Egyptians." Moses led this people with favor, and it followed him because of his answer of Hanini to the Lord. As leaders in this room, I wonder if you too would say the same to God if he called your name today through an extraordinary event in the middle of the monotony of life. Would you also say to God, "Here I am, Hanini," and mean it? Would you walk away and focus intently on the road in front of you and go without hesitation? Well, this is exactly what Moses did. As leaders, wouldn't it be great if we had on the tip of our tongues and seared onto our hearts, Hanini, and mean it? Later in this Exodus story, Moses has an extraordinary opportunity to put Hanini's statement to the test once again. Turn to chapter 33 of Exodus and join me there with a conversation between Moses and God. But before we dig in, let me catch you up on what's been going on in their lives. As you know, the Israelites are God's chosen people, and they have found favor in God's sight. His presence follows and covers them as a covenant promise. Leading up to chapter 33, when Moses is called up to the mountain of the Lord, Sinai, to receive the commandments for right living before God, and he remained there for many days. Meanwhile, on the ground were the people Moses had been leading for 40 years. What they did next enraged the Lord. They created a golden calf out of plundered jewelry and began to worship it. And their excuse was, "Well, Moses, you were just taking too long." Their fear and lack of faith in the covenant-keeping God got the best of them, and their decision to worship and create a false god was about to erase the entire Israelite people for good. Because of this one fateful decision, God said his presence would not go further with the people, and in essence, withdrew his favor promised in the burning bush. Now let's get to the meat of the message in chapter 33. Verses 12 to 23, we find Moses and God in conversation. We see Moses pleading with God to remember that he promised that his favor would follow him and the Israelites. He's not just pleading for his own sake, but for the sake of the people. Verse 13 says it like this: "Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight." Moses knows that their identity as God's chosen people is tied together, and their existence as a nation will cease if God withdraws his favor and presence. He reminds God in verse 16. He says it like this, "For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not that you're going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people?" As their leader, Moses intercedes on their behalf for God to remember, because he knows that his generational equity with God covers him and is transferred to them through his relationship with God. Notice in verse 13 and 16 how Moses includes himself and the people. Particularly verse 16, where he reminds God that although they messed up, they're still his people. And he includes them by changing his language from the use of I to the use of us and we. You see it when he says, "It is it not you're going with us that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth." Verse 15 says it even more pointedly, and he says to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us back from here." There is a deep reminder to God that their shared generational destiny is intricately tied together. But the problem remains that they sinned by creating a false god and bowed to it. In response, Moses pleads not to leave the people behind and to remember his promise of favor. Moses reminds God that his people, that they're his favored people, and he finds with him what he finds must be transferred to the people as a whole if they are to continue to exist as a nation. Throughout this encounter, he's reminding of God of main things, like God is the promise keeper, of the favor of his presence to follow the people and set them apart. And we saw that, remember, in verse 21 of chapter 3, "I will give this people favor inside of the Egyptians." That's God making that promise. This is God. This is Moses reminding God of what he said. He had made a promise, and he knew that God is the keeper of promises, so he asks in boldness for God to remember, because he knows that favor symbolizes their strong relationship. It is an act of kindness toward another person, and it is a divine quality that protects the righteous like a shield. And here's the best part: it grants the bearer to intercede on behalf of other people. Favor in this passage reminds us that God's face is turned toward his people in grace and compassion because of the one man, Moses. When Moses pleads for the people, he is interceding for them to have God's acceptance, grace, and goodwill to follow them into the promised land because of the favor of God upon his life that transfers to the people. Moses knows that what sets them apart from other nations is that God's presence goes before them and behind them. And we know this from Exodus 13, verses 21 to 23, because it says the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. It's so that they would travel safely. Moses was reminding God that his presence not only protected them, but is what led them and covered them all this time. The word presence in the Old Testament, the presence of God, has a specific connotation. From Moses' encounter from the burning bush, he was brought into dialogue with the Lord, which over time resulted in him knowing God face to face. He became his friend. The presence of the Lord is the place of blessing. And those who sin must be thrust from God's presence, which is what happened with the Israelites in chapter 33. This close relationship between God and Moses was a benefit to Israel because it allowed Moses to intercede on behalf of God's people, to ask for and receive special favor, not just for himself, but on behalf of the whole nation of Israel. This is evident in the entire history of their desert wandering and in this current passage as we see God relenting due to this relationship. Speaking of relenting, that's what happened next in our story. Because you see, God's nature is about relenting, which is a very churchy way of saying forgiving. After Moses reminds God that what his people mean to him, he points out God's unchanging nature. And he relents from his plan to turn his back and leave them. It's said like this in verse 17, "And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight." The God of covenant relationship relents because of the relationship he has with their leader Moses and agrees to go with them. Ultimately, God relents because of his unchanging nature of forgiveness toward his people, regardless of their shortcomings and sinful nature. He is our hero because his unchanging goodness is tied to his forgiving nature. Moses knew that he could count on God's favor and goodness because they had not changed throughout their relationship. God's nature is unchanging, and that includes his unconditional nature of forgiveness. As leaders, we can take this a step further and use our relationship with the Father to intercede on behalf of others. If we can grasp how intimately tied together his goodness is to forgiveness, our thought process toward our relationships with one another could change. If we could help people grasp the goodness of God as consistent and unchanging, they would not doubt they are forgiven, seen, and wanted by a merciful and loving God. If forgiveness from a good Father is grasped, there wouldn't be anything that we wouldn't present to God, and our relationships with him we become the main focal part of our lives. Because when you feel forgiven, that's where freedom is found. Acting forgiven by a good Father makes you act like a loved son or daughter. The actions that flow from that are a generous life rooted in a grateful heart. When we feel this, we can't help but act on it and pass it along to others as a byproduct of our heart change. As a mature person in God's presence, we need to take heed to the constant reminders of us of God's goodness and forgiveness, and constantly be alert to the schemes of the enemy to make us forget. Like Moses, we need to constantly be reminded of God's faithfulness in our lives and keep in step with the idea that here I am, Hanini, is not a once and for all time event, but a constant laying down of self for the sake of the gospel message and for the sake of the people around us. As leaders, we must be willing to intercede daily for those we lead so that none are lost. Living Hanini before God, saying with absolute certainty that here we are, willing to go wherever he calls us, no matter what it takes, would change the world. Would you join me in the Hanini of God?